Hi everyone, welcome back to Winging It. My name's Rebecca and I run Feather Stitch House. We're in week 18 and it's the first week in the month, which means it's our colour prompt. And if you've seen the prompt over on Instagram, you'll know that this month we're going to be exploring bright colours. So we're moving on from our pastels, we're sticking with our full rainbow, but this time we're going fully bright. So this week we're going to be using some applique skills. You're going to need some scraps of felt, and I'm going to be taking inspiration from some artists of the past. So I hope you're up for that. So gather all your bits and pieces and let's get stitching. Well, starting my process this week by thinking about bright colours and what bright colours suggested to me. And I did actually come up with quite a lot of ideas. The first one was based around the rainbow, and I thought it might be nice to just make a rainbow similar to our mandala, but just making it more of a rainbow this time, and maybe adding a phrase that inspires us underneath. So that was my first idea. But I did think it was quite similar to our mandala from last month. Then I thought about poster paints, and that got me thinking about kids art and crayons, and I thought about making some crayons out of applique. We could use felt to make the actual crayon and maybe wrap it in a colour coordinated fabric and then add some overstitching and maybe add some colour names, you know, like on Crayola crayons, they tend to have colour names, don't they? But I thought that might be a bit simple. Then I thought about fruit, and a little while ago I made this fruit rainbow thinking about different fruits in different colours, and I thought about maybe creating something like this on our panel. So just simplifying it a little bit because we're working on a smaller scale. So maybe doing an orange and a strawberry and a lemon, some grapes for the purple, and maybe a kiwi, just to add a bit of variety. But the thing that really got me inspired was thinking about Matisse. These are just printouts of pictures that I found on Pinterest. So one of the things that Matisse did was experiment with cutouts, and he would play around with colour and make cutouts with paper and sort of overlay them to create really striking effects with colour. Another one was this one, which I really like. It's that sort of leafy, quite organic, but in really striking colours on the white background. And I've got another more complex one here. So this is all paper cuts, and they're all sort of stuck down, leaving white borders in between, and the colours really pop. And I remembered that when I was in, I think, year 7, I did a piece of art based around Fauvism. The piece that I did was based around this, and one of the techniques that he used quite often was to use complementary colours next to each other. So you've got this sort of aqua blue in the water there against the orange fish, and then you've got this yellow green with purple in the background, and it makes the colours really pop. And another version, one of his later works, was this one, which is called Yellow Cat with Goldfish. And again, you can see you've got the sort of reds and greens next to each other, and the orange and blue and green, and really striking colours with pops of white every now and again, just to bring out those colours even more. And he tended to use quite strong black lines and outlines as well, and this really inspired me. So the idea that I decided to go with in the end was a sort of goldfish scene. So I've sketched out some goldfish, and I was thinking about those very graphic leaf shapes from this piece, and I thought we could lay some green in the background and have these bright orange fish, and I thought it would work really nicely on quite a strong blue background, so that we've got those contrasting colours, the blue and orange next to each other with some green. And we can play around quite a lot with overstitching, so even though Matisse's work's quite simple, the shapes are quite simple, I thought we could play around because we're not trying to copy Matisse, we're just being inspired. So I thought this was the one that I was going to go for, so that's where we're heading. So I've got my blue felt, and I thought we could start by doing a bit of stitching. So I've got a scrap of green here, and what I thought I'd do is stitch first and then cut out around the stitching. So I'm going to keep my blue handy. I thought what would be nice for the leaf shapes is some feathered chain, so that's one of our stitches of the month, and I'll put a link to that video if you haven't seen it just at the top of the screen. So feathered chain works on 4 lines, so I'm just going to draw those lines in first of all. So we've got our 4 lines, and I'm going to use the same colour over the top. So I've got some green embroidery thread here. I'm going to use 2 strands just so that it stands out but isn't too bulky. So feathered chain works on a diagonal, so we start off by making our first chain stitch. This could be tricky for you to see because I'm working green on green. So we do our first chain and then take our stalk down at a diagonal following the same line. Then we go over to our 4th line and repeat the process, coming back across. I do explain this stitch in much more detail in our tutorial video, so don't panic if you haven't quite understood what I'm doing. I need to be careful here that I'm not going beyond my square. Couple more, I think. Yeah, that'll do nicely, I think. So I'm just going to finish off on the back. Making sure my thread tails are quite small. Now I'm just going to roughly cut that out, just because I want to be able to move it, and that piece is a little bit too large. And what I'm going to do is cut around my stitches to form leaf shapes. So I'm leaving a decent sized border there around when I'm cutting, but I'm just sort of making that bold shape that Matisse uses. Okay, so we've got our leaf shape there, and I'm going to pop that on and just leave it there. So I'm going to make another couple of these to put in the background, and then I'll come back and we'll look at the next stage. Okay, so we've got our 3 leafy plants there that are going to form our background. So they're in place. So my next step is to make my goldfish, and I'm not confident that I can redraw this. It was a bit of a miracle. So because they fit really nicely in the space, I'm going to trace these to create my templates. So I'm just going to go around the edge of the main shape of the fish, and I know I've missed out a couple of fins. I'm going to make those separately, here are my templates, and I'm going to use paper scissors because we don't want to use our best embroidery scissors on paper. You could do this with bond web if you wanted to. And I'm going to draw around my templates. They're not quite as robust as card ones, but I'm only going to use these once. And I'm going to cut those out. Okay, so here's where I'm up to so far. I've laid out the fish and I've got my green plants in the background. So I think our next stage is going to be to start stitching things down, and I'm going to keep this quite simple stitching wise because we're going to overstitch shortly. So I've just got a single strand here, and I'm just going to put a little stitch catching down the felt every now and again. So this is just a plique stitch essentially, and I'm just catching those plants down every so often with a little applique stitch. So if you're not sure about a applique stitch, I did a whole video on applique back in week 5, and I'll put a link in a card at the top of the screen so that you can have a look at that. Okay, so that's the first one. I'm going to just stitch down the rest of the pieces and then we'll look at some overstitching shortly. So I'll be back in a moment. Right, so I've stitched down my leaves and my fish, and I'm really loving the contrast between the orange and the blue there and the bright green. I think it's looking really striking. So our next stage is to add some overstitching. I thought we'd start with the fish as they are our focus, and I'm just going to separate out 2 strands. And I thought it would be interesting to use our wheat ear stitch. So this is one of our stitches of the month. If you haven't seen those stitches in that video, I'll put a link at the top of the screen. But it's essentially a fly stitch. So make the fly stitch part first, and I'm sort of locking these wheat ear stitches together. So they're not actually joined, but I'm stitching them in a way that they sort of slot together. So I've got my fly stitch part of the stitch, and then I add a detached chain underneath it without finishing one stitch off. So instead of a stick on my fly stitch at the bottom, I've got a loop instead. Another good one for scales is feather stitch. It's a really effective stitch to use to create scales because you've got that sort of interlocking V shape that happens with feather stitch, and we looked at stitches like feather stitch and chain stitch and fly stitch back in our March tutorial where we looked at looped stitches, so that's a good one to check out as well. Love wheat ear stitch, I think it just looks so fab. I'm just going to finish with a fly stitch just at the end there as we've got to the end of the body. I'm absolutely loving that. So now I'm at the end, I'm just going to finish off the thread, and I'm going to go back and add another line either side. And it is better to finish off rather than have a long trail of thread up the back. Now I'm going to try and interlock these. So I'm starting my stitch here at the top of the chain there, and I'm going to try and interlock them. So that stitch is going to the very edge of the fish, and then I'm going to make my chain so that it lands at the point where that fly stitch finished. So now I'm going back to the top of the chain. You can make these slot together however works best. Okay, so we've got some scales on our fish now. I just love how textural that looks. What I'm going to do now is add just a little bit of texture to the tail so that it doesn't look so flat in comparison with the fish body, and that I'm going to do very simply by just adding some straight stitches. So I'm moving to a single strand now. Actually, I wonder if stem stitch might be better. So I'm starting with the top layer of the tail. Let's try stem stitch and see. We talked about this stitch back in the winter tree video, all the way back in week 3, and it is one of my go-to stitches, stem stitch. I use it all the time. It's so versatile. Great for lines, great for outlines, but great for adding texture as well, particularly when you work the lines very close to each other. So I'm just sort of following the curve of this tail fin. Okay, so that's what I'm doing on the tail fins. So I'll just make an eye while I'm here, and I'll stitch the rest off camera because you don't need to watch me doing the same thing over and over and over again. So for the eye, obviously a fish's eyes are going to be on the side of its head. I've just got a bit of black, and we're going to add a little bit more black and some white shortly, but I'm just going to add a tiny bullion knot. You could use a French knot, but I think because we're viewing this fish from above, its eye's going to look longer than a French knot would look. So I'm just going to add maybe just 5 wraps down the side there. I think that looks a lot more effective than a French knot would look, but that is just my opinion. So if you prefer a French knot, I've got 2 strands here. And again, bullion knots are in our knots video from last month, so there's more detailed instructions there to help you with those knots. People tend to love them or hate them. I love them. So that's where my fish is looking. I'm going to add in the rest of that overstitching, and then we'll come back and add some finishing touches. So I'll see you shortly. Okay, so I've added my scales and the lines on my fins. So what we're going to do now is make it look more Matisse. So if I bring back in the picture that inspired us, you should be able to see that most of the details in this painting are outlined in both black and white. So if you look at this cat's paw here, the paw itself is yellow, but we've got quite a strong sort of sketchy black outline, and inside that is some white. And again with the fish, we've got a black outline, and then on the outside is a sort of haze of white around the edge. So what that does is it makes the fish really pop against the green of the water. And so what I'm going to try and do is mimic that a little bit on our fish and sort of create a bit of pop. So I'm going to keep my picture there to inspire me, and these are sketchy lines, so we don't have to go all the way around, but I thought if we did a little bit of stem stitch around the edge. So I'm going to go black first and then add the white afterwards. I don't know if you can, if the camera's picking it up. Every now and again I'm leaving a space where there's no outline, and that's going to make it look a little bit sketchier. So where you've got curves when you're using stem stitch, you need to shorten your stitches a little bit, otherwise you're going to get quite an angular line and it won't follow the curve. So wherever you're going around a curve, just make sure your stitches are that little bit shorter. So I'm really liking the way that's looking so far. I think that has made it pop. So now I've got 2 strands of white, and we're just going to repeat that process and add our white layer. So I'm definitely going to put it in the gaps where there's no black, but sometimes I'm going to overlap the black as well. So I want to work to the outside of my black stitches. There's our fish that's been Matissed up, if that's a thing that can happen. I'm just going to repeat that process with the other fish. So I'll just do that and then we'll come back and look at the finished piece. Okay, so there's our finished piece. It's our goldfish inspired by Matisse and the Fauvists, who were the kings and queens of colour. Hope you've enjoyed that. I'm absolutely delighted with that piece. It's really simple. It's not my usual style at all, but I think it just works so well. And I love the way that the felt lends itself to this kind of piece, because it gives you that lovely flat colour. I'm just loving the way that looks. So I can't wait to see what you create inspired by bright colours. Do share what you create with hashtag FSH Winging It, and if you want to see all of our bright colours pieces together, also add hashtag FSH Winging It 18. And that's it for this week. So looking forward to seeing your creations, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.